Hello everybody, it's a pleasure to be here. I talk a little bit about the implications of climate change on wealth management today. And you might be wondering, Third Eyes Analytics, what has that to do with it? Why the implications of climate change on wealth management? I'd like to discuss why it is relevant, why it affects you personally, it affects your clients, how it affects you and the clients, and last but not least, how you as financial institutions can cope with it. The context of the discussion today lies effectively in our purpose. Let me start differently. The purpose of us is all about the realistic modeling of future wealth. So we are a company, Zurich-based wealth tech with 25 people, and we really focus on future wealth development, so wealth planning in fact, and it's all about being realistic. For that we have received 15 awards in the meantime, and if you want to effectively have a realistic modeling of future wealth, you need to include climate change. I will talk about that later on and give you the reason. Maybe one or two things with our modeling of climate change, with our future wealth modeling, we could convince the largest life and pension provider in Switzerland and have clients acquired across primarily German-speaking region, but also in the Nordics in the meantime. We are 23 people, and we've been founded 2015 and entered the market 2018. So let's go back to the topic. We all know that EU policymakers have defined the upper limit of temperature change by 2 degrees, and all policy actions are supposed to limit that to that extent. Now, if we look at the recent prediction, and Schroders is doing that, it's just one example, they update it more or less on a monthly basis, we see that they assume a temperature increase of 3.3 degrees, so far beyond of what policymakers have defined as a maximum. Now, I don't want to discuss today whether we have climate change. We do not doubt scientific resources, we just take it for granted. So the problem today is that your clients, financial investors, you have no clue about how does climate change, rising temperatures, effectively affect your personal situation, how does it affect your financial goals. So this is the challenge, and I think with the solution which we're going to present afterwards, we can create that transparency. Let me move on. So today I'm going to show you how we make this climate change impact effectively transparent, so how it affects a portfolio, how we make it tangible, how it affects financial goals, how we can enable mitigation in the sense of building climate robust portfolios, and last but not least, how we can at the same time mitigate, or no, mitigate is maybe wrong, but reduce the carbon emissions of the specific portfolio. That's what I'm going to talk about. Before I lose credibility completely in here, I like to give you the scientific basis, because everything we do, we base on studies, scientific studies, which have been widely accepted. And what you see here is the study from William Nordhaus. He's a Yale University professor. He won the Nobel Prize 2018. And this study serves as basis at the moment. We're further refining that, but serves as basis for what I'm going to present you afterwards. If we look at what he outlined, we see that rising temperatures have a negative effect on GDP growth. As a consequence, because GDP growth is one of the key determinants in explaining long-term returns, that will affect long-term returns of risky assets primarily, negatively. And that obviously directly affects you, me, clients, because if you hold investments, your wealth will just not develop as it used to develop in the past. And this is why we need to include climate change into wealth management and consider it accordingly. So there is more than just the Nordhaus model with which he won the Nobel Prize. There are overall 3 integrated assessment models, all from the last 10 years. So Nordhaus is the DICE model, It's the integrated model of climate and economy. And now I need to look at my notes because the abbreviation of the others is difficult. Then there's the fund model of Antoff and Toll, climate framework for uncertainty, negotiation and distribution. And this model estimates the damage in regional productivity. It includes more than just GDP, but also several socio-economic factors. And last, we have the PAGE model. This is the one we're currently implementing on top of the DICE model. And this uses two climate variables. It uses effectively temperature change and sea level rise, plus several social economic factors. And it is in contrast to the DICE model, a regional model, so it estimates the impact on regional GDP growth. PAGE stands for Policy Assessment of Greenhouse Effects. What we see on this slide is that if we have a temperature increase of 2 degrees, that the damage, the global damages on percentage loss in GDP is rather limited. And this is also why the policymakers have effectively defined that 2 temperature degree scenario as the upper limit. Now we've seen before that Schroders predicts clearly, and again, it's just one party which predicts, it's one of many parties, that's what I wanted to say, predicts a clearly higher increase in temperatures. And what we see in all 3 models in a consistent manner is that A, it's nonlinear, B, if we go beyond the 2 degrees, we have a clearly more severe effect on the damage of global GDP. And again, this is why it's the 2 degree maximum defined by policymakers. Now, let's come back to the topic and look how we can make that climate change impact transparent, tangible, how we enable mitigation while reducing the CO2 footprint. So let's start with a simple client portfolio. Consisting of equities, cash, so 10.5% cash, 52.5% equities, and the rest in bonds. Equities distributed across Eurozone. That specific portfolio has a wealth forecast, and we just look at the dark blue line, which is the median. Then we have a good scenario, we have the bad scenario. So we do scenario-based simulation over 1,000 capital market scenarios. But let's look at the median. It looks very nice, there's a nice development. If we simulate, just for illustration purposes, a 4-degree temperature change, we have a clear reduction, and we see that the scale is not the same, so we end up here with almost 2 million, while here we end up with 1.2 million in the median scenario. So this is a concrete portfolio. Now let's look at, for example, out of that portfolio, what could that specific client, which will be entering retirement 2049, pay out during retirement until expected life end. And we see that without climate change, out of that portfolio, in the median scenario, the client could pay out 7,000, well, it's only 5,300 in a 4-degree scenario, temperature increase scenario. So a significant effect for you, me, clients, based on the financial goals. Now let's look how we do the mitigation. So for that, we have a little video, which we're going to play right now. We just assume that we have, can you guys play the video, please? That we have, perfect, the pension goal of 7,200. We see the median at the end just suffices. If we have a 4-degree temperature increase and we simulate, the client runs out of assets before expected life end, so cannot fully achieve that financial goal anymore. We can now mitigate that by optimizing the portfolio into a client-specific asset allocation, which just searches for instrument which allows, again, in the 4-degree scenario, to fully achieve the goals, again, that specific goal, namely payout of that pension. And we do that by optimizing the strategic asset allocation. Why do we do it by optimizing strategic asset allocation? Because 90%, and you probably know that, of the portfolio volatility comes from asset allocation and not from selection. Everybody's talking about sustainable investing, in sustainable investing about selection these days. Well, the big chunk where we have a huge contribution is based on the asset allocation. So we really create here a bespoke asset allocation, which again maximizes that specific client situation, that specific financial goal, So from a non-full payout of the pension, the money needed during pension or during retirement, we can increase that again accordingly. Good. Now, how do we reduce the CO2 footprint? The CO2 footprint of that specific portfolio, which we started with, we see is 178 tons per million US dollar investment. So all the data which we have used comes from the index providers. So it's not data which we have kind of invented, but really sourced the data from the index providers. And what you see is the carbon intensity, carbon emission intensity per million US dollar investment. And the portfolio we just had leads to 178, while the optimized portfolio, as a result of the new allocation, leads to 100 tons per million US dollar CO2 investment. So we obviously assume with that, because this is asset allocation based, that we have a purely passive replication of that portfolio. But that's not the point I want to make. The point I want to make is that everybody's talking about selection, which is super important, because we have heterogeneous investment instruments with regard to CO2 intensity, that's clear. But in order to have a good selection, we need to complement it top-down ideally. And the reduction of the CO2 footprint is effectively a side effect. We do not optimize that. We optimize the financial goals of the client. But because in a 4-degree scenario, the optimizer chooses asset allocation, which is less CO2 intense, asset classes which are more climate robust, we have as a nice side effect also that reduction of the CO2 footprint. So this also convinced recently the technology fund of the Federal Office of Environment in Switzerland, from which we even have received the funding now to further market and distribute this solution across the target markets we're active in. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to any questions you may have. If we don't have time for questions, you find us, our booth is just on the left of the entrance to this stage. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you.